In the autumn of 2003, on a gravel road outside of Lacombe in central Alberta, a 41-year-old woman named June Hartwell spent $1,340 on 62 bales of silvery birch brush, a second-hand chipper she'd found listed in the Ponoka News, and a used moisture meter that the man at the co-op in Red Deer had never seen come across the counter before. The brush came from a woodlot she'd hired 2 teenagers to clear on the north end of her property. The chipper was orange and loud and missing its left side panel. The moisture meter was the size of a TV remote. The fellow who'd sold it to her out of a box of surplus forestry equipment in Camrose had told her straight that he wasn't sure what she planned to do with it on a cattle operation, and she told him that was all right. She wasn't entirely sure yet either. June loaded everything herself into the back of her '99 GMC Sierra. She didn't ask for help. She thanked the man, paid with a check, and drove the 40 minutes back down Highway 2 toward the gravel turnoff with the radio on low. By the time she pulled through her gate, the afternoon had gone gray the way Alberta afternoons go gray in October, fast and total, with the smell of frost coming in from the north. Her neighbor, Dale Perkins, was burning brush at the edge of his east field, and he watched her truck come down the road with the chipper hitched behind. He could see the machine was old and loud. He watched until she turned in. He didn't wave because June Hartwell was not the kind of woman who needed a wave. That was the beginning. Over the next 3 years, Lacombe County would have a story to tell about June Hartwell. Like all stories in farm country, it moved fast and changed as it went. From the co-op to the coffee shop on Lacombe's main strip, from the coffee shop to the auction mart, from the auction mart to the curling rink. At every stop, the story got a little stranger, because June Hartwell, widow, beef farmer, daughter of a mixed grain operator from Bashaw, was not the type of person anyone expected to be doing what she was doing. And what she was doing looked, to most people in the county, like a very expensive way to make a mess. To understand what June did with that chipper and those piles of brush over the following 3 years, you have to understand who she was and where she came from. June was born in 1962 on a grain farm 10 kilometers south of Bashaw, the oldest of 3 children. Her father, Harold Fenwick, grew barley and canola and ran about 60 beef cows on the side, on land that had been in the family since her great-uncle filed on a quarter section in 1919. The land was good land by Alberta standards, black soil over clay subsoil, but Harold was a man who worried about it the way other men worried about their bank balance. He walked his fields in the early morning before anyone else was up. He kept a spiral notebook, just a plain one from the pharmacy in Bashaw, where he wrote down what he noticed: soil color, earthworm counts, which sections crusted over after a hard rain and which ones didn't. He'd been keeping notebooks since 1971. When June was old enough to walk the fields without losing her boots in the mud, Harold made her walk slowly and look down, not at the crop, at the ground beneath it. "Anybody can see a field from the road," he told her once, standing at the edge of a section that had grown thin along its north edge. "You see it proper by getting your boots into it and walking every part until you know it like your own kitchen floor." June married Tom Hartwell in 1988. Tom was a beef producer from the Lacombe area, a careful, even-tempered man who had inherited 2 quarter sections from his parents and added a third on his own before he and June married. They ran just over 140 head of Black Angus on that land. It was a dry July. It was a solid operation, not the biggest in the county by any measure, but solid enough if the weather held and the calf prices stayed reasonable. Tom died in February of 2000, a Monday, of a stroke in the bedroom at 4 in the morning. He was 44 years old. June found him when she reached over to turn off the alarm clock, and his hand didn't move. She called 911 from the kitchen, and then went back and sat beside him until the paramedics came, because she was not going to let him wait alone in the cold bedroom of a house they had built together. After the funeral, Tom's brother came out from Edmonton and suggested she consider selling the cattle, the equipment, at least one of the quarter sections. Take a breath. Let someone younger carry the weight. June thanked him for making the drive. She told him she had horses to feed. He drove back to Edmonton. She went out to the barn. She managed the operation alone for 3 years before the chipper. What June saw when she walked her land in those first years, without Tom, was not catastrophic. It was the kind of quiet deterioration that doesn't show up in a photo and doesn't make you stop the truck on the road. The south pasture, which they'd used most heavily for summer grazing, was thinning along the lower slope. The organic matter was down. She could tell by the way the soil looked when she turned it over with her boot, lighter than it should have been. Less that dark, dense black that her father had taught her to look for. The earthworm count she did every spring, the same count Harold had shown her, was dropping in the south and east sections. Not dramatically, just dropping. She'd been reading. Not the farm magazines that had come to the house since she and Tom subscribed in their first year. She'd read those too, every issue. What she was reading now was something she'd found by accident. A newsletter out of Saskatchewan, published by a soil researcher at the University of Saskatchewan named Dr. Carolyn Betts, who had spent 15 years studying what happened to pasture soil biology when organic material was returned to the surface rather than removed or burned. The idea at the center of it was not complicated. Healthy soil needs feeding. The biological community in topsoil, the fungi, the bacteria, the nematodes, the beetles, the worms, all of it needs a continuous supply of carbon-rich material on the surface to function. When that material is absent, the biology thins out, the soil structure weakens, and the land begins to lose its capacity to hold water, to grow deep-rooted plants, to recover from dry years. The problem with most beef operations was not that farmers were bad managers. The problem was that they were removing organic material from the land faster than it was being returned. Burning brush, hauling off deadfall, keeping pastures tidy. All of it made good visual sense and cost the land something invisible. The solution Dr. Betts described was to chip the woody material, branches, deadfall, hedge trimmings, and spread it directly on the pasture surface at a depth of 2 to 3 centimeters. Not straw, not hay. Woody chip material, high in carbon, slow to break down, the kind that feeds fungal networks rather than just decomposing fast and disappearing. It would look wrong at first. It would look like someone had run a brush fire backward. But given time, 2 full growing seasons at minimum, the biological activity underneath would begin to shift. The earthworms would increase. The fungal threads that connected plant root systems would multiply. The soil would soften and deepen in ways that were measurable if you had a probe and the patience to use it. To do this on a pasture scale, you needed a chipper and a way to spread the material. Not a tractor-mounted unit, too expensive. A towable chipper, the kind you rented or bought used. The kind June drove 40 minutes to Camrose to hook up to the back of her Sierra in October of 2003. She started with the south pasture. She chipped everything from the birch woodlot and spread it by hand and with a small ATV-mounted spreader across the lower third of the slope, where the soil had thinned the most. The cattle were moved off that section entirely. The material went down pale and raw and smelled like fresh wood and rain. It looked from the road like someone had made a very large and purposeless mess across the middle of a perfectly usable pasture. What the neighbors could not explain, what Dale Perkins watched from his fence line and could not account for when people asked, was the state of things. It wasn't a mulch, not exactly. It wasn't compost. It wasn't anything anyone in Lacombe County had a clear word for. June Hartwell had put down what looked like a logging site debris field on her best pasture, moved her cattle off it, and was leaving it there. Not for a weekend, not for a month. She'd moved her cattle and was leaving the mess for a year or more, running the herd instead on the north sections, in a tight rotation that crowded them in ways that looked, from outside the fence, like a mistake. The chipper ran twice a week through that first winter, when the ground was frozen and the cutting was easy. The sound carried. Dale Perkins could hear it from his equipment shed. His wife mentioned it at the coffee shop on Main Street. The woman at the next table had heard it too, and knew June slightly, and said she'd driven past the south pasture and stopped to look and couldn't make sense of what she was seeing. "It's all chip and mulch," she said, "like she's mulching a pasture, like a garden bed, but for cows." The women at the table looked at one another. Someone laughed. It wasn't unkind. It was the laugh of people who had seen a lot of ideas come through farm country and mostly go home again. By spring of 2004, the story had its shape. June Hartwell had gone a little sideways after Tom died. It happened. You understood it. You worried about people who lived alone on a farm and started reading unusual newsletters and chipping their pastures into something that looked like a backyard composting project scaled up to 200 acres. Her father had been a careful man with soil. Everyone in Bashaw knew Harold Fenwick's notebooks. People had mentioned them at his funeral. But this was something different. This was a widow alone, spending money on equipment and ideas that didn't fit the way anyone in central Alberta ran a beef operation. The county extension office, when someone thought to mention it to them, said they hadn't come across it. They'd heard of pasture mulching in horticultural contexts, not on cattle land. The story went from the coffee shop to the auction mart in April, where it arrived in the form of a question. Had anyone driven past the Hartwell place lately and seen what she was doing to that south pasture? Several people had. The consensus, delivered over styrofoam cups, was gentle concern. Not ridicule, exactly. More like the kind of careful watching you do when someone you respect seems to have taken a turn. In the second year, June added a monitoring system. She bought a soil probe and a pH meter and a set of small white flags, the kind surveyors use, and she put the flags in 12 fixed spots across the south pasture and across the north pasture for comparison. Every spring, she took the same measurements in the same spots. Soil compaction at 4 inches, soil temperature at 2 inches. Earthworm count from a fixed size sample. She wrote everything in a notebook, the plain kind from the pharmacy in Lacombe, the same way Harold had written in the plain kind from the pharmacy in Bashaw. She also began talking by telephone in the evenings after the work was done, with 2 other producers, one in Manitoba and one in British Columbia, who had read Dr. Betts's newsletter and were running similar experiments on their own land. These were long conversations, technical, specific, about chip, depth and cattle reintroduction timing, and what happened when you got a wet September on top of a freshly chipped pasture, and whether the fungal network established faster under birch versus poplar material. June's phone bill climbed. Dale Perkins, who was on a shared rural line in the old-fashioned way that some people still were out past the highway, picked up one evening in January and heard June on the phone talking to a man in Winnipeg about earthworm density per square meter. He put the receiver down and told his wife. His wife told her sister. The chipping continued. By the second winter, the south pasture had its full coverage, about 90 acres of chip material at varying depths, the oldest sections now 15 months into decomposition. June could see something changing in those oldest sections when she walked them in the early spring before the snow was fully off. The material had darkened, it had compressed. At its edges, where it met uncovered soil, there was a line of earthworm castings she hadn't seen the year before. She didn't say anything about this at the coffee shop. She wrote it in the notebook. In the summer of 2005, a woman named Dr. Sandra Mead knocked on June's door. She was an associate professor of soil ecology at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, 45 years old, doing a study on unconventional carbon inputs to degraded pasture soil in the prairie provinces. She'd read a short piece Dr. Betts had published in an agronomy journal, citing June's operation as a working example. She'd called the county extension office, which had confirmed June's name and address, and said they had no formal data on the operation. June made tea. They went out to the south pasture for 2 hours. Dr. Mead was the kind of scientist, Mead, who got down on her hands and knees in the field, which June appreciated. She dug small sample holes with a penknife and looked at the cross-section of material and soil. She asked to see the flag measurements. She looked at the notebook. She asked June to walk her through the timeline of each section. When the chip material had gone down, how thick, what species of wood, what the pasture had looked like before. Before she left, she asked if she could come back the following springs with a graduate student and a proper soil sampling kit to do systematic measurements across the monitored sections and compare them with neighboring unimproved pastures of similar soil type. June said yes. She did not mention which neighbor she was thinking of for the comparison. Dr. Mead came back in May of 2006 with a graduate student named Theo, who was 26 and had grown up in Calgary and knew soil science from textbooks and laboratory work rather than from walking land since he was old enough to hold a notebook, but who was methodical and asked careful questions and took his time. They spent 3 days on June's property and 2 days on the adjoining sections. Meanwhile, the story in Lacombe County had been running for 3 years. 3 years of the chipper. 3 years of the chipped south pasture, fenced off and resting. 3 years of June Hartwell on the phone in the evenings, talking to people in Winnipeg and Prince George about earthworms and fungal threads. The people who drove past her place on the county road had begun to slow down without quite knowing why. Dale Perkins stopped his truck on the road one morning in April of 2006 and got out and stood at the fence line. He couldn't articulate what he was looking at. The chipped material had largely disappeared into the surface by then, incorporated into something that was no longer chip and no longer quite soil either, but something in between. The grass coming up through it in the spring was a shade darker green than he remembered from that slope. He stood there for 5 minutes. He didn't mention it to his wife because he couldn't find a way to explain it that didn't make him sound like he'd been wrong about something for 3 years, which he had. The coffee shop conversation shifted slightly that spring. It didn't reverse. It didn't become a celebration. It became quieter on the subject of June Hartwell's south pasture, which in farm country means something. In the summer of 2006, Alberta got dry. Not disaster dry, not the kind of dry that makes the evening news, but the kind of sustained dry July that is particular to the central prairies and separates the land that can hold what moisture it has from the land that can't. The pastures across Lacombe County went brown in the second week of July. The older, heavier soils held color a little longer. The lighter sections and the slopes, with compacted subsoil, browned first and browned hardest. June's north pasture went brown like everything else. She made no claim otherwise. What was different was the south pasture, which she had reintroduced the cattle to that spring on a careful rotation after 2.5 years off. The grass in the south pasture went dormant, but it didn't brown the same way. It thinned at the tops and stayed green at the base, longer than the surrounding land. When she pushed her soil probe into the monitored sections in early August, the moisture reading was measurably higher than in the comparison sections on Dale Perkins' land 40 meters away, across the fence line. Not by much, by enough. Dr. Mead called in September. She had the data from the spring sampling and the follow-up work she'd done after the dry July. Her voice on the phone was the voice of a researcher who has numbers she wants to say carefully. She said that the soil organic matter in June's improved sections was 28% higher than in the comparable, unimproved sections on the neighboring properties. The earthworm density in June's monitored spots was up more than 3 times the count from the neighboring sections. The water infiltration rate, the speed at which water moved into the soil rather than running off was 40% higher in June's south pasture than on the comparison land across the fence. There were 3 soil fungi species in June's core samples that were absent entirely from the comparison samples. There was a pause. "Are you confident in those numbers?" June asked. "Yes," Dr. Mead said. "This is real, June." June thanked her, wrote the numbers in the notebook with the white cover she'd been using for 2 years, and put it in the filing cabinet beside the flag measurements. She went outside and stood at the fence line of the south pasture for a while, looking at the evening light on the grass. She had wanted to know for 3 years if what she was seeing was real, or if she was seeing it because she needed to. The numbers said it was real. She still didn't call anyone. She went in and made dinner. The winter of 2006 to 2007 was cold and long in central Alberta, the way winters there are, when they mean it. January brought a cold snap that held for 10 days, the kind that cracks wood and freezes the waterline if you let the heat drop overnight. February was gray and still. The county felt far away from everything in February, which it was. In March, the Lacombe County Agricultural Society held its annual meeting at the community hall south of town. About 35 producers attended. The agenda covered input costs, the new federal crop insurance provisions, a drainage issue on the east side of the county, and a proposal for a shared grain storage facility. June Hartwell was there, as she had been every year since Tom died. She sat near the back. She did not speak. This was not unusual. June at a meeting was June at the edge of her south pasture, watching, patient, missing nothing. Near the end, a producer named Warren Buckle, who ran the largest beef operation in that part of the county, mentioned that he'd been hearing about something called biological soil amendment. Some kind of program a few operators in Manitoba were running. He'd gotten a printout from an agriculture website. He held it up. He wanted to know if anyone had information on it. There was a short silence. Dale Perkins said, "That's what June Hartwell's been doing." He said it simply, without drama, and then turned toward the back of the hall. 34 heads turned. June looked at Dale. She looked at Warren. She looked at the printout in Warren's hand, which referenced Dr. Betts's work and a regional adaptation program, the same newsletter she had been reading since 2003. "How long?" Warren asked. "Since autumn of 2003, June said. 3.5 years. The room was quiet, in the particular way a room gets quiet when the air in it rearranges. Warren said he'd like to hear more. What happened over the next few months was not a celebration. It was not a ceremony. There was no gathering where June Hartwell stood before the county and received an acknowledgement. What happened was quieter and more permanent than that. Warren Buckle drove out to June's property in April. He was a practical man, not easily moved. And he walked the south pasture the way a man walks land he might be considering buying. Slowly, saying little, looking at the ground. He asked about the chipper and the cost of the chip material and the time involved in spreading it. He asked to see the flag measurements and the notebooks. He crouched down in the oldest section of the south pasture and pulled back the grass and looked at the soil surface for a long time. The soil was dark, darker than his own land across the road. He pressed his thumb into it, and it gave in a way that his own south field didn't give. He didn't say anything for a while. My grandfather used to say you could tell a farm's future by how it smelled after rain, he said eventually. The good ones smell like something's alive. The tired ones smell like dust. He pressed his thumb into the soil again. This smells like something's alive, he said. June said nothing. Mine smells like the other thing, Warren said. He placed his first chipper rental order in May. Dale Perkins came by in late April without calling ahead. He found June replacing a post on the east fence line and helped her without being asked. They worked along the line in the morning quiet, driving posts and re-stretching wire. When they were done, Dale said, "I drove past your south pasture a lot of times these past 3 years, June." She waited. "I thought you'd gone and made a real mess of a good pasture," he said. "I said so more than once." "I know," she said. "I'd like to have Dr. Mead's number," he said. "Or whoever she'd send. She'd probably send Theo," June said. "He's good. Ask him about the infiltration rates." Warren's farm manager was last among the close neighbors. His name was Kevin, a careful man in his 50s who had managed Warren's operation for 12 years and who had kept his own counsel about June's project, which was his way of saying he'd thought it was impractical but hadn't wanted to say so in front of Warren. He came to June's door on a Saturday in June, a Saturday morning, and stood on the step with his hat in his hands and told her that the test sections Warren had chipped in May were looking thin and wrong, and he needed to know if that was normal. June opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "That's normal. I'll show you the timeline." The summer of 2006 had been the dry test. The summer of 2007 was something different. A second dry summer, back to back. The kind of sequence that reveals not just the immediate state of the land, but its direction. Land that had managed through one dry summer on its fail in the second one. Land that had genuinely improved was different. By mid-July of 2007, the pastures across the county were in a state that older producers recognized and didn't like. The word drought wasn't used yet officially, but the word was moving through the coffee shops. On June's south pasture, the cattle that had grazed it on rotation since spring were holding their weight. Not gaining, she wouldn't claim that, and she didn't. They were holding through a dry July that was taking condition off cattle across the rest of the county. She wasn't buying supplemental feed. She wasn't pulling calves early. She wasn't doing what several of the operations to her north and east were doing, which was starting to sell into a softening fall market to reduce the numbers they'd have to carry through winter if the grass didn't come back. Warren Buckle, who had started his program too late in the spring to see real results, that first season drove past June's property twice a week that August. He stopped one morning and stood at her fence line for a long time, looking at the south pasture. He called Dr. Mead himself in September. The story that had moved through the county for 3.5 years was moving differently by August of 2007. It wasn't yet a clean story. People in Lacombe County don't hand over clean stories about land management in the middle of a dry August. because August in the prairies has humbled too many confident people. But it was a different story than it had been. It was the story of a woman who had seen something in her land that nobody else had stopped to look for, and had spent 3.5 years and a used chipper finding out if she was right. The co-op in Lacombe ordered a pallet of soil moisture probes in September. The man behind the counter had never stocked them before. He put them near the front door, beside the seed catalogs, and didn't have to explain them. 4 producers asked about them in the first 2 weeks. Dr. Mead came back in October with Theo and a second graduate student, a woman named Priya, and a full week to document what the dry summer had shown across the county. They drove June's sections and the neighboring properties. They took photographs. They took cores. Dr. Mead published a paper 18 months later in a Canadian soil science journal. June Hartwell was mentioned by name. June had thought about it for 3 weeks before agreeing to that. She'd decided that if the land was going to teach something, it should be allowed to. In November of 2007, the Lacombe County Agricultural Society held a special session, not the annual meeting, a special session called by Warren Buckle for the purpose of hearing from June Hartwell about what she had done with her land over the past 4 years. 41 producers came. 6 more than the annual meeting in March. June brought the notebooks. 4 of them. The plain kind with white covers. 4 years of measurements in pencil. She brought a copy of Dr. Mead's preliminary findings. She brought Harold Fenwick's notebook from 1978, which had nothing to do with chip mulching on pasture land, but which she'd carried in from the truck without thinking too hard about why. She stood up at the front of the community hall. She had never spoken publicly about anything in her life. She was not a talker. She unrolled a hand-drawn map of the South pasture with the flag positions marked, and she started with the flag positions because that was the simplest place to start. And she was her father's daughter, which meant she started with what she could see. She told them what the South pasture had looked like in 2003. She told them about Dr. Betts's newsletter and why it had made sense to her. She told them about the chipper and the chip material and the cost, the full cost, broken down without rounding numbers in her favor. She showed them Dr. Mead's infiltration data and explained what infiltration rate meant for a dry summer. She told them about 2006 and 2007 and what she had and hadn't sold. Warren Buckle asked the first question. Dale Perkins asked the second. Kevin didn't ask a question. He looked at the map and nodded the way men with 12 years of careful management in their hands nod when something clarifies. The questions went on for more than an hour. June answered everything she knew how to answer. She said, "I don't know" 4 times, and each time wrote down the name of someone she'd call to find out. Near the end, a man at the back of the hall, one of the older producers in the room, who'd been running beef cattle in the county since before June was born, raised his hand. "June," he said, "I want to ask you something. All those years you were out there chipping brush and spreading it across what looked like a perfectly good pasture, and people were saying you'd gone and lost the plot. Did you ever think they were right?" The room was quiet. June looked at him for a moment. "Every winter," she said. "That's why I kept the flags in the same spots every year." The room went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before. The kind of quiet that means something true landed where everyone in the room could feel it. By 2009, 6 farms in Lacombe County were running biological soil amendment programs of one kind or another. Not all of them were doing it the way June had done it. Not all of them were seeing the same results, because the results come from consistency and patience and a willingness to keep measuring even when the measurements are disappointing. But 6 farms were trying. Warren Buckle was one of them. By 2010, Warren had treated his south and east sections and was tracking soil organic matter every spring with a probe system he'd bought after driving past June's property for the 100th time. His land hadn't reversed 40 years of continuous grazing in 3 seasons. He didn't say otherwise, but it had begun to move in a direction, and he knew what direction meant on land that had been going the other way since his grandfather's time. Dale Perkins converted the following spring. It took him 2 full seasons to see anything he could put a number on, and he told his wife, in the kitchen, one November, that you had to be willing to not see it for 2 years or you'd talk yourself out of it too soon. Kevin kept calling June in the evenings with questions about timing. The calls were long and specific. He asked once, after a difficult summer, whether it ever felt like it wasn't worth it, whether there were times she'd been ready to pull the flags and chip something else. The winter of 2004 to 2005, June said. The south pasture looked worse than when I started, like I'd just made a mess and let it sit there. What did you do? Kevin asked. I put the flag measurements in the notebook, she said. I went inside. I made soup. I called the man in Winnipeg. She never once said, I told you so. Not to Kevin, not to Dale, not to Warren. She just answered the questions. Dr. Mead finished the full study in 2009. One section was specifically about June's operation. It was written in the language that soil science requires, measured, precise, conditional. But what it said underneath the language was that 4 years of biological soil amendment on degraded pasture land had produced statistically significant and replicable improvements in soil organic matter, earthworm density, water infiltration capacity, and fungal diversity, and that those improvements had held through 2 consecutive dry summers without reversal. June read it twice. She thought the language was too careful. She understood why it had to be. In the spring of 2011, the county extension office in Lacombe, the same office that had told someone in 2004 that they hadn't come across pasture chip mulching in a cattle context, held a soil management field day. They asked June Hartwell if they could use her property as the demonstration site. 53 producers came on a Wednesday morning in April. They parked along the county road and walked in through the gate. June met them at the gate. She took them to the south pasture first. She walked them through it section by section. She showed them the notebooks. All 4, plus the soil cores, Dr. Mead had left her copies of. She showed them where the organic matter had changed and let them use a probe to feel the difference at the fence line between her land and the comparison section across the wire. An older woman in the group, a producer from the east side of the county who had been running beef cattle on similar land for 30 years, pushed a probe into the soil on June's side of the fence, then crossed the wire and pushed it into the comparison section and stood there looking at the readings for a long time. It's like 2 different soils, she said. Same clay base, same black topsoil. Same county, Dottie, same county, June said. 4 years of chip material. The woman looked at the fence line. My dad managed land like this for 35 years, she said. He never touched the organic matter question, thought it took care of itself. So did mine, June said. He watched the land more carefully than almost anyone I knew. But the tool he needed wasn't available to him yet. Where do you start? The woman asked. June told her. She told her about the chipper and the wood sources and what species chipped best. She gave her Dr. Betts's contact information and Dr. Mead's. She told her about the flag system and why fixed measurement points mattered. Why you needed to measure the same spots year after year rather than finding the best-looking parts to core. The woman wrote it down in a small notebook she'd been carrying in her coat pocket. She put the notebook away and looked at June. "I've got 160 acres on the south side that I've been watching get lighter for 20 years, she said. "I'm 58. Think it's too late to see a difference." June looked at her. "Takes 3 years to see the first numbers," she said. "Maybe 4. You'll see enough." The woman nodded once. She put her pen away. They stood together in the south pasture. The 53 producers. And June Hartwell, looking at the land that 8 years earlier had been the object of the most enduring piece of local mythology in the county coffee shop. The wind came across the flat land from the northwest, which is where the wind comes from in central Alberta when it means to remind you of something. The grass moved in it in the quiet, particular way that well-rooted grass moves. Not frantically, not fighting it, just acknowledging. June watched it, the way her father had taught her to watch it, which was the way you watch something when you understand that you are in a conversation with it, not in charge of it. What she had started in the autumn of 2003 did not have an ending. It had a continuation. A used chipper missing its side panel. 62 bales of birch brush from a woodlot, cleared by 2 teenagers from Lacombe. A moisture meter that no one at the co-op had seen come across the counter before. A woman who pushed flags into the same 12 spots of ground every spring for 8 years and wrote down what she found in a plain notebook from the pharmacy. And the land, fly, which had been going one direction for a long time, and had been persuaded, slowly, with chip material and patience and one woman's willingness to be wrong for 2 full winters before the numbers told her she wasn't, to go another. That is not a story about a woman who was smarter than the people around her. The people around June Hartwell were careful farmers who knew their land. What June had was a different question. Not how do I manage what I have, but what does this land need that nobody has thought to give it? She found the answer in a newsletter from Saskatchewan and an orange chipper, and 4 years of being the woman whose south pasture looked like a mess from the road. She kept the flags in the ground. The land answered.